I am Dr. Stacey-Ann Wilson. I'm a senior lecturer of politics in the Department of Political Science at University of the West Indies Mona campus, which is in Jamaica. I welcome you here this morning, afternoon, evening to enjoy a little talk about Garvey. Now, I'm not a historian. I am not a Garvey scholar. I am merely someone interested in the topic in terms of how it speaks to us today in our movements, in our day-to-day self-actualization as Black people. So if you take that as a context, you can reserve your ultra critique about my misunderstanding of the historical blah, 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 because it's not my area. Okay, so let's just get started. Garvey and the UNIA. So the race first principle is personified in the militant, internationalized Black nationalism of Garvey and the UNIA. And that can be seen pretty much in every publication that they have, and it can be heard in pretty much every speech that he's ever uttered. The race first principle captured the imagination of Black people living in America, but also in Africa and in Europe. Black leaders before or even during the time of Garvey did not look like Garvey. They didn't come from the same background as Garvey. And in a sense, they tended to be middle class or aspirant upper middle class. They tend to be educated or mixed race or some combination thereof. So they didn't look, sound, feel like Garvey. The UNIA sought the liberation of all Africans at home on the continent and abroad in the diaspora. And this wasn't particularly new to Garvey or the UNIA, but they certainly made it their sort of marching orders that being free was not just about being free where you were. You also had to be free wherever people like us resided. The movement preached and promoted the concept of Black is beautiful at its core. They built business and advertising around this core notion. Whatever else the race first as a concept means, for Garvey and the UNIA, it clearly meant self-love, self-reliance, self-determination for people of African descent. There's no getting around that. To put race first as a Black person is to love yourself. To put race first as a Black person is to say that I am going to be reliant on only Black people, which is Black businesses, Black churches, Black cultural, psychological, all of that. And part of that is to be self-determined. So whether you're talking about sovereignty as a nation or being self-determined in your own household or in your own personal self, to say I am because I am. That was fundamental to the movement. While race first demanded a level of segregation of the races, so whites segregated from Black, Chinese segregated from Chinese, Indians from Indians, et cetera, it did not mean Black supremacy, which a lot of people talking about Black nationalism miss. And when they're talking about Black nationalism, they really only mean Black American nationalism. It doesn't usually include other Blacks. But in this sense, Garvey was not talking about nor interested in anything called Black supremacy. It was not about Black people being better than anybody else. At no point is that the yardstick in which is measured. It's that Black people are equal. They should be equal to everybody else. And specifically in the Americas context, Black people putting themselves first meant being free from their oppressors and able to appreciate and have access to full equality like everybody else. And this is a quote from Garvey, and I title it "Dying to be Free." The first dying that is to be done by the Black man is in the future will be done to make himself free. And then when we are finished, if we have any charity to bestow, we may die for the white man. But as for me, I think I have stopped dying for him. Now, the important thing here is that there's a world war, a so-called world war going on, or as I call it, a European civil war. that was going on. And because a lot of the Black nations were not free, they were forced to fight and die for their oppressors' national identity, essentially. So if you think about the context where this is happening, so Americans are very well aware of people going off to war, Black people going off to war and fighting, coming back to the U.S. and still being treated how they were treated prior to going. So clearly nothing had changed with them putting their lives on the line in service to their oppressors. So Garvey is making the point that the first person you should be dying for is yourself, not for somebody else. And if after you've done that, after you've freed yourself, after you've done all you can do for you, then and only then should you be looking to fight for defending other people, especially when those other people are your oppressors. Garvey was most definitely not about any white savior. And you can see that in the way he's organized both the social aspects, the political aspects, and the commercial aspects of the UNIA. Garvey excluded whites from UNIA membership, which to my mind explains why the FBI had to hire its first Black agent, because I think without this movement, it would have taken them some years before they ever considered diversity, if one Black person in a whole organization can be called diversity. But anyway, they had to hire a Black person to pose as a UNIA member in order for them to infiltrate the UNIA. So Black was this organization that they had to utilize someone that was Black to infiltrate and then report on the UNIA and Garvey and his activities in order for them to lay charges against them. So unlike other Black organizations, both then and now, Garvey rejected financial support from whites, individuals, as well as organizations. And we can speculate as to why that is. I mean, there's no shortage of information about whites infiltrating what would otherwise be called subversive or rebellious revolutionary organizations, only to topple them. It's a thing as old as time in this sense. So there was a direct acceptance, I guess, or recognition that if you excluded these people from your organization, one, you'd be more united and more whole, but also more importantly, that you wouldn't be dependent on them intellectually and financially. And so that went on to the point where, so Garvey did not cooperate or associate with whites or white organizations unless they agreed to a separation of the races, which is to say, they would come to have their conversation about whatever, or they could have common ground about, you know, a variety of issues, in so long as they don't interfere with each other. They kind of go to their respective corners and live their lives. So this idea around Black nationalism and, you know, coming up or in the face of or in the midst of white nationalism. Now, let's be clear that white nationalism is very much about white domination, white supremacy, and the idea that everybody other than white, straight men and women were inferior. And Black nationalism doesn't have that tone. It doesn't have that tone of superiority that white nationalism has. So when Garvey agreed to meet with the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, this was seen as like, what? Why? What? Like, those people hate you. And sure enough, they do. But one thing for Garvey that they had in common was the separation of the races. And for him, that was good enough grounds for a conversation to happen, I suppose, because the segregation is important to the movement around getting Black folks united in mentally, physically, economically, emotionally. White supremacists had that too, but again, for different reasons. Black nationalism around being anti-oppressed, essentially. You want to be free of white people and the physical, psychological, and social oppression and economic exploitation that comes with trying to live among, within, and integrate with. And there is no part of Black history in the Americas that doesn't have, that isn't laced with um, serious, I'm looking for the politically correct word to use here, infringement of the rights of people of color. There is no story that can be told of non-white people wanting to integrate, not even wanting to integrate, but being forced in some instances to integrate with whites that wasn't at the, that didn't, the brunt of that integration isn't felt by Black people. Garvey's separatism and Black nationalism views were not embraced by many of his peers, especially those who were in organizations that were, if not largely, but substantially funded by white members, white intellectual and context, whether it's the church or whatever. So of course, this was a controversial position for Garvey and the UNIA to take, but his position was unmoved. He says, we can canonize our own saints, create our own martyrs, and elevate to positions of fame and honor Black men and women who have made their distinct contributions to our racial history. I am the equal of any white man. I want you to feel the same way. Now, it's one thing, and this is an important thing, that last bit, I want you to feel the same way. It's one thing for you to feel empowered and for you to feel the equal to, but it's another thing to galvanize a group of people so that they also feel it. They feel it, they see it, and can enact it as part of their daily lives. That was basically the aspiration of a race first principle, not to be, to be outdone by anybody else, but to stand in your own and to be able to fend for self in a real way. There's a long speech that he has as part of his address to the second UNIA convention around race first. And so the Negro Improvement Association seeks to emancipate the Negro everywhere, industrially, educationally, politically, and religiously. Now just look at that. Industrially, obviously you're talking about what you're doing for a living commercially, what you spend your bodies doing, your ability to both consume and produce. Educationally, now we're talking at a time when a lot of Black folks barely finished elementary school, let alone high school and university. So we wanted to emancipate them from this idea that the only thing they were good for is to work manual labor or sing and dance for massa kind of thing. Educate, elevate them, emancipate them politically. Now in a lot of the world at this time, Black people did not have the right to vote, including in the United States, including the Americas. Say the Caribbean, for instance, that didn't have independence till the 1960s or whatever. This is 1921, he's having this conversation. Emancipate yourself religiously. Again, although he was a staunch Christian, there were others who were practicing, and even within Christianity, he's talking to those who are practicing and utilizing what would be sort of the white figurines and whatever. He's just like, well, we can Blackify that, like we need to emancipate ourselves from the idea that our savior looks like somebody else. It also seeks a free and redeemed Africa. Again, at the time, Africa was under colonialism. In a lot of ways, it's still under colonialism, different faces, same mastery. And he was a staunch supporter of that sort of emancipation project. And that's part of his race first. I'm not gonna get into all the bits and pieces. You can read, you can see it. But the point is that the Negro people, wherever they were in the world, had to be emancipated. And the only way that you can emancipate yourself is if you actually think of yourself within the context of the thing that you share with all the other people who are experiencing that. And it's, for him, what he calls race, right? We don't necessarily have the same idea of what race is or isn't, but really it was a language of the time. the use of the word race. I mean, I'm saying at the time, like we don't use race now, we do. And we want to say fun and exciting things about other people and their capacity. We draw up these things called race, this socially constructed thing that we pretend is unmoving and unchanging. But we know that it serves particular purposes, and that's why we're here. Anyway, that this race first principle is really a lifetime commitment. It's not something you can start and you pick up and you sort of end and say, okay, well, we've accomplished what we set out to do now. Now we can move on to other people. We haven't accomplished it. We are still in the midst of that struggle. In prison, he wrote, after my enemies are satisfied, in life or death, I shall come back to you to serve even as I have served before. In life, I shall be the same. In death, I shall be a terror to the foes of Negro liberty. If death has power, then count on me in death to be the real Marcus Garvey I would like to be. If I may come in an earthquake or a cyclone or plague or pestilence, or as God would have me, then be assured that I shall never desert you and make your enemies triumph over you. So in a sense, we're still hoping for, working with the dead Marcus Garvey to help us to elevate this race of people, of Black people who have still, despite emancipation, despite pseudo independence, are still under the yoke of Western, and I'm going to broaden it now to beyond just saying white, but Western institutions. So that the principles of race first, which is self-love, self-reliance, and self-determination, have been stalled in a sense, which is why Garvey continues to be important within the Pan-African movement. There is a stalling because we have come to many of us now live in the affluent diaspora. So we still have most of us who are not in the affluent diaspora. Well, a lot of us are in the affluent diaspora, and being in the affluent diaspora, so Europe and parts of the Americas, we have been seduced in some sense with the idea of assimilation. And where we haven't been seduced, we have been forced into assimilation. And in so doing, we think that in order to survive, we have to forget who we are or diminish who we are in order to fit in. Now, this is counter to everything that they've been trying to do, since the 1990, since basically 1914 to 1940. During that period, we're literally counteracting the efforts that were made. And people think that you saying race first, like now when you see people talk about Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, that somehow means that other people's lives don't matter. That's obviously not what that means. It doesn't mean that your race is first for other people. It just means that your race is first for you. And that somehow is controversial or whatever. I don't know. I couldn't tell you, but I am first. It's like me saying I love me first. I don't see what's controversial about that, but that's me. So we're going to leave it there so that exciting other things can be said and I can learn. That's it for me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patrice, and I have a special interest in the Garvey movement, especially the roles of women. I was drawn to this topic mainly because Pan-African history often neglects women. The few scholars that have paid attention to the contributions of women typically represent them as helpmates, community feminists, efficient womanists, or focuses on the wives of the few women intellectuals of the movement. This short mini lecture examines women's significant contributions to the UNIA as leaders, how they politicized Black masses, they organized and resisted racist stereotypes, voiced their concerns to help and direct the work of the UNIA. They also played in this kind of overarching African redemption philosophy rooted in the UNIA. They use their speeches, their marching through the streets, their pageantry, also, creating the Declaration of Rights, which was the law for the UNIA, and beyond, to further the equality of Black people. Why this talk is so important is it's important to understand the inner workings of a Black liberation movement such as the UNIA without understanding the activism of women on the ground and how their intersectionalities uniquely position them to advocate for the freedom of Black people in a particular way. Also, I wanted to highlight the auxiliaries of women and the kind of the gender structure and how it was played out. And I think it will tie deeply into Professor Wilson's lecture when she's speaking of self-love, self-reliance, and self-determination. Often used by women throughout the years of UNIA. I think it was first coined in 1921, but this concept of no race can rise higher than its woman. And again, I used it as the title of my talk because I think it's important to note that if you don't look at the gender aspects of a movement or a whole group of women, you're not fully be liberated if the women are not. So I think it's just a powerful phrase for us to remember. And also, if you were to take anything away from this lecture, is that no race can rise higher than its woman. What is the importance of the UNIA, especially in the context that we're living in, being Black Lives Matter, and on a global scale, right? Like, what is it about the Garvey movement can we learn in today's struggles for equality, for freedom? And, I thought it would be good to start with one of Garvey's most famous quotes. A people without knowledge of their past history and origin and culture is like a tree without its roots. And this was from a speech that Garvey had done in Canada here. It's kind of talking about emancipation and the importance of knowing of past in terms of thinking through freedom. Because if you don't know what your ancestors have done or the people before you've done, then how can you move and imagine into the future? And then, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who's an Afrofuturist, and she said Garvey was an Afrofuturist. He imagined a world where we could be free, and he tried to create it. And even the last quote from Professor Wilson on even in his death, he's alive, speaks to like the playing with time where, it's not this linear thing. It's a constant, like he's still here and present with us. I'm starting with Amy Ashwood Garvey. Learning Garvey over the years, I never realized that she was potentially one of the co-founders of the movement in 1914. And historian Toni Martin and Leon Yard have written biographies about her. And it's contested, but when you start to look at the historical facts, she played a role. And so I think it's important for us to think through how is she remembered, and why do we sometimes forget about her significance, but also a lot of the activism that she did after her and Garvey got divorced, in the early 20s, and she, moved on, went to Europe, was quite close with Claudia Jones, who was a powerful woman in terms of Black liberation. But do we hear about her? And, a lot of, both these historians have commented on the ways in which she really wanted to have a kind of equal structure for women, with the lady president and the male president of each division. Women were in charge of their own, divisions and committees and all that, and men. And it was this kind of separate but equal, but equal in quotation marks. Even in the original women who were on the board of directors at the time of, from 1914, I think up to 1919, they had equal amount of women board members and then men. And so, I'm curious about how different the UNIA might have looked had they never got divorced had she stayed kind of, if they had stayed married, if she had stayed at the kind of forefront of the movement, if it would have looked different in terms of gender politics, or if she just the foundation for a next woman. But I think again, you know, it's important for us to remember Ashwood and her role, and also question the erasure of her contribution and her value. Something I want us to think about when you're thinking about women's roles in the United is, how do we get to this? Because, you know, I remember reading, I think it was Hakeem Adi had like the main Pan-African movement leaders, and I couldn't find, like, I could count how many women were there. And, you know, I remember in the beginning they acknowledge, oh, there's not a lot of women because they're just not present in the sources. And I'd like to kind of challenge that, because the Negro World, which was the main newspaper of the United 1919 to 1983, you could find women's voices everywhere. And as a historian, it's actually quite overwhelming. Like, I have a hard time slimming down which voices I want to use to kind of, you know, tease out the complexity of the Pan-African thought present in the organization. So you know, one thing I would suggest for those who are interested in learning more about the women and their role, go to the way back of each issue. There's this section called the division news, and the division news really talks about, you know, who are the soloists of the program, who planned this fundraising drive, a woman who created a dramatic club. All of that richness is in there. You just have to dig a little bit harder. So it might not be at the very front of the newspaper, but where people are reporting about the daily happenings of the visions, you really can get to the voices of women. And again, it's a digitalized source. You can't just, you know, I was hoping, oh, you could just kind of type in women or type in names, but you really have to actually do the tedious work and just go to the last couple of pages of the Negro World, and you'll start really seeing the voices of and the impact of these amazing women. How do women feel free? How do they live out their freedom and equality? How do they fight for their freedom and equality? And one of the big things I thought I found a lot of was the women and girls speeches. So Henrietta Davis, who is the international organizer for the UNIA, and you know, she stayed loyal to the UNIA for over a decade under Garvey, and then had a separated when the UNIA divided between the Garvey faction and the New York faction. Um, she played an amazing role, and she was in her 60s at the time, so she traveled throughout Panama, um, Jamaica, all over the place. And she would have these amazing speeches, and she herself was an actress. And so, you know, she used her skill set and the amazing work and activism she had done before arriving at the UNIA and in for the benefit of African redemption. So you could find a lot of her speeches in the archive. One of the other major archives to look at is Robert Hill. He's gathered like volumes of stuff on not only from the Negro world, but also from FBI files, etc. Mary Johnson was another woman who was known for fundraising skills and linked to the Negro Factory Corporation for creating a women's industrial exhibition at one of the conventions. So she was, again, one of those like groundbreaking women who would travel around and do speeches and promote industry among Black women. Sister was a woman from Panama who also helped promote people to buy stock in the Black Star Line. And you could see her speeches around how important it is to have African redemption and to go back to Africa. And then I thought it was interesting. I found this recently. So, you know, they're supporting not only women, but also girls of different ages also standing up and making an impact in their communities. I wanted to use an example from this Black missionary who had gone to Liberia, where the UNIA wanted to to settle Black people. And again, I think it's important for us to think through the ways in which women tried to in place say, hey, this is what we want to do. This we want to ride alongside and be, be there. And now, if there are men of vision and men of brains and men of character and men who would gladly die for this cause, then I want you to know that there are women also who will join you and will gladly die with you, that Africa might be redeemed. And this is again at one of her speeches at Liberty Hall, I think in August, in June 1920. I want you men to remember while you're the stronger part of the greater whole, that larger numbers of this great woman. So again, I think it's important to like highlight this idea of the stronger part, like huge, and some of the rhetoric that women might play into particular gender roles, just to further maybe their own agendas, or they agree that those are the gender roles that women should hold. But yeah, I really liked her speech and kind of what she did, and this was all kind of like a pumping up and getting people ready for the first convention. And this is a picture from one of the international conventions. Just realized I'm going to put this here so you could see the full picture, and you could see everyone kind of waiting outside of Liberty Hall here, getting stoked, and people came from all parts of the world, right? From Siberia, from Panama, from Canada, like from Winnipeg, like all over the place to come represent their communities and report about, the inequity that they were facing, but also the good work and the amazing activism that was coming out of their communities. Again, here's some pictures, and you'll see some of the signs that people are holding as they're marching. What was important about the 1920 convention was really they created this Declaration of Rights, and this Declaration of Rights had over 40 items, down to like how you should be treated, how you shouldn't have their head shaved in prison, in parts of the continent, that there should be, equal education for that Black kids should be taught by Black teachers, and that they shouldn't be filled up with inferiority complex. Again, coming back to the self-love, self-reliance, self-determination. They created and they thought through the ways in which people could, again, imagine to be free. I keep coming back to freedom because I think it's an important anchor for us. What's important about this Declaration of Rights is I started to dig through the names who had signed, and I started to see that, some of these women were from, the States, some were from the Caribbean, some were teachers, some were domestics. They all played a role in reporting from their communities, and then signing and saying, hey, we had a part. But recently I found the FBI file that I mentioned, not FBI file, I think it was a letter that had mentioned that there was a lot of people who did not sign because had they signed their name, they were afraid of what they might have to go through when they went back to their countries, right? And so they had to be, because I always wonder why it would say thousands of delegates, but when you would count, there's, 100, a little over 120 signed, but I knew there was way more delegates that were present at the convention. And I think it was just for their own security, going back to their country. So, even though I have the 20 here, there must be so many more women that potentially weren't here. And if you look at some of the UNIA archives from the Caribbean, you see a lot of arrests happening of women. So, it's a big deal to be part of this radical organization. Again, I bring up the parades here because it's kind of like this walking of freedom. And again, thinking through Professor Wilson's thinking through self-love, like what does it mean to march and be um, amazing in your blackness on the streets of Harlem and going outside. If you look at the parade routes, sometimes they were outside of the black Harlem. So, they're in places where they're not welcomed or that they're treated less than, and they're walking with pride with their uniforms, etc. So what does that mean, right? So parades were a space where women could really um, perform, where women could really live out their blackness. I wanted to talk about the power of the arts in the UNIA, and here is Henrietta Davis again. Um, and she was an actress quite before, but I think because of her connection, actress, creating a theater company, all of that. This is Mary Houston, and she got paid as a soloist. And you see other women soloists that would travel with Garvey when he would do his speeches. And so sometimes I wonder about, there's that analogy of when you go to church. Some people are going for the music or the choir versus the preacher. And so I sometimes wonder, was it always Garvey people were going for, or were they going for these women singers, these performers? And they're generating fundraising and money by being present and traveling with these different areas and doing these mass meetings. Another important kind of role for women, and very connected to the self-reliance and self-determination, was the Black Cross nurses. And if you go back or ever get a chance to look over the Declaration of Rights, there's quite a few items there that talk about the issues of health, the access or lack of access to health within the Black communities. And so, instead of wait around for whites to build them hospitals, for whites to allow them to enter into like nursing colleges, they created their own. And so, the few Black licensed trained nurses taught a group of Black women in their divisions, and it just expanded. And so these particular robes are all white, but when they actually went to their community, a green uniform. But this white robe they would get on completion of their course. So it was a big deal. At the time, white nursing colleges only allowed up to 35. Black Cross nurses, UNIA, they allowed women up to 45 to join. So it was a really powerful group, and they were constantly helping their community out in these amazing ways. I found recently this piece on the Cleveland, Ohio Black Cross nurses that were feeding 128 unemployed Black people every day, and over the months they had fed over 6,000 people. And these are some of the like grassroots activism that these women were doing, which was quite amazing. Here's some more pictures of the nurses here, and this is Black Cross nurses in Quebec here in Canada. And oh, so this is one of my favorite pictures, and this is the African Motor Corps. And so, I mean, how often do you hear about paramilitary group, right? And, because of what Professor Wilson had mentioned, the fact that they had infiltration from Blacks within the UNIA to try to help destroy the UNIA, they really had to like have their own secret service. Garvey would walk with African legions, which would be the male version of this. But within a year of the African legions, you saw the women, and I think that's powerful in itself. Because it's like they're ready for battle equally alongside their men. And again, you don't see this in any other Pan-African organization at the time. Now, again, connecting back to the Declaration of Rights, and because I'm going way over time, was the youth, the juvenile division. So again, an answer to the type of education that was something that was mentioned by Professor Wilson, was the industry, economically, industrial, educationally, politically, socially. Well, this is an educational piece. So they decided, hey, we could have these juvenile divisions that will bring up youth and be the next generation of leaders. And here again, you see the girls um, marching. And again, I think of, the earlier speech I have this of the 16-year-old. They're getting trained up to support this African redemption. And here's Henrietta Davis again going, and the delegation that went to Liberia. Um, I think this was in 1924. Again, women's involvement in trying to further African redemption. And I think I'll end. So here at the bottom of it, you see Women's Arts and Industrial Exhibition. And again, this is the ways in which women contributed to bringing up um, fundraising for the UNIA. And so, they would have these advertisements in the UNIA to support the Black Star Line, or to join, to support the Black-owned businesses. And again, this Women's Art and Industrial Exhibition happened in 1921, where they spent weeks of bringing in Black women entrepreneurs. I'm saying, this is the work that we're doing. This is amazing work, that we are more than capable of working in all these different realms of factory and industry and entrepreneurship. So again, women just had such a powerful role in the UNIA. And I ended with, I was in Liberty Hall in Kingston, and I saw this board of great queens of Africa. And I think, Garvey really played to the importance of royalty in the UNIA, and the elevating Black womanhood to this kind of queendom. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves, when we think of these Black Pan-African movements, that you cannot fully understand it without understanding the queens. So thank you.